What if Neanderthals had survived? Not as a museum exhibit, not as a footnote in a textbook, but alive right now, walking the same streets, breathing the same air, watching the same sky as you. Think about what that world looks like. A species with bigger brains than ours, stronger bodies, eyes that see in the dark. A species that survived 400,000 years, 40 times longer than every civilization humans have ever built combined. Still here. What changes? Does science look different when two kinds of human intelligence are working on the same problems? Does war look different when the other side is physically twice as strong? Does the word human rights mean something different when there are two kinds of humans? Nobody can answer those questions. Because something happened 40,000 years ago that made sure we would never have to. A species with every physical advantage, bigger brains, stronger bodies, 400,000 years of survival experience disappeared. Completely, silently, within 10,000 years of meeting us. Not in a war, not from a disease, not because they were stupid or weak or primitive. Scientists have spent 150 years trying to explain it, and the answer when it finally came had nothing to do with intelligence. Nothing to do with strength. It had to do with something so simple, so ordinary, that it is almost embarrassing. For a long time, Neanderthals had a terrible reputation. People imagined them as hairy cavemen, dragging clubs, grunting at rocks, and somehow losing evolution because they were too dumb to keep up. Basically, prehistoric background characters. But that image was never really science. It was more like bad imagination with a skeleton attached. When the first Neanderthal fossils were found in Germany's Neander Valley in 1856, the world was still learning how deep human history really was. So when scientists saw a skull that looked human, but not exactly like us, many people assumed it belonged to something primitive. Heavy brow, strong bones, different face. So the story became simple. They must have been less advanced. But modern archaeology has been slowly destroying that idea. In 2020, Bruce Hardy and his team found direct evidence that Neanderthals made a 3-ply cord from tree bark fibers in France, around 52,000 years ago. That matters because twisted cord is not simple. It can lead to nets, bags, handles, traps, clothing, and complex tools. It means planning. It means technique. It means someone understood how separate fibers could become something stronger together. So no, they were not just smashing rocks. They were building technology, quietly, before civilization even existed. But here's the thing. Neanderthals were not designed for our world. They were built for theirs. Ice Age Europe was not exactly a friendly neighborhood. No heated rooms, no medicine, no grocery stores. No, just stay inside until winter ends. Their world was cold, dark, dangerous, and physically brutal. And in that world, Neanderthals were terrifyingly well adapted. They had shorter, wider bodies, thick bones, powerful muscles, and larger eyes. Their brains were also, on average, slightly larger than ours. But this is where the story gets interesting. In 2013, Eilund Pierce, Chris Stringer, and Robin Dunbar argued that Neanderthal brains may have been organized differently from Homo sapiens brains. Because Neanderthals had larger bodies and larger visual systems, more of their brain may have been used for seeing in low light and controlling a physically heavier body. That could have left less relative brain capacity for managing large social networks. So the problem was never, were they smart? The better question is, what kind of intelligence were they built for? Neanderthals may have been brilliant at surviving the immediate world. The cold, the dark, the animal tracks, the shape of danger moving between trees. They were not failed humans, they were specialists, perfectly shaped for a world that no longer exists. And this is where the story becomes genuinely strange, because by this point, Neanderthals sound almost impossible to defeat. They were stronger than Homo sapiens, better adapted to cold environments, surviving Ice Age Europe long before we arrived, and carrying brains slightly larger than ours. So what happened? For a long time, scientists assumed the answer was simple. Maybe Homo sapiens were just smarter, but modern research has complicated that idea a lot. In 2026, researcher Thomas Schoenemann and his team argued that there is no strong scientific evidence proving Neanderthals were cognitively inferior to Homo sapiens. In some ways, the differences between Neanderthals and early modern humans may have been smaller than the differences between human populations alive today, which means the old explanation, they lost because they were dumb, doesn't really hold anymore, and that's where another theory becomes terrifyingly convincing. In 2026, archaeologist Ariane Burke and her team suggested the real difference may not have been intelligence, but connection. Homo sapiens formed larger social networks. They traded across longer distances, shared information faster, moved between groups more easily. Neanderthals, meanwhile, seem to have lived in smaller and more isolated populations. And that changes everything. Because when climate shifts, animals disappear, or food becomes scarce, the species with more connections survives longer. Not necessarily the strongest, not necessarily the smartest, just the least alone. And honestly, that may be the most uncomfortable part of the entire story, because humans today are more connected than ever before. Yet loneliness is still becoming one of the biggest problems on Earth, which makes the extinction of Neanderthals feel strangely modern, like a warning from another version of humanity that almost survived beside us. If Neanderthals had survived until today, the modern world would probably feel completely different from the one we know now. Not slightly different, completely. Because for all of recorded history, Homo sapiens has lived with one dangerous belief: we are the only humans. But imagine waking up in a civilization where that was never true, where another human species existed beside us the entire time, a species physically stronger, built for harsher climates, carrying larger brains, shaped by a completely different evolutionary path. Every system on Earth would change around that fact. Politics would change first. Countries would argue over whether Neanderthals should have equal rights, representation, separate laws, military roles, land protections. Some governments would treat them as equals, others would fear them. And history suggests fear spreads faster than understanding. Sports would become chaos. Imagine a species naturally stronger than Homo sapiens competing in combat sports, military endurance, or survival training. There would probably be separate leagues, separate standards, separate debates about fairness. And science? Science would become obsessed with them. Their brains, their genetics, their strength, their resistance to cold, their psychology. Entire industries would form around studying them. But the biggest change would not be physical. It would be psychological. Because humans would no longer see themselves as the final version of intelligence. For the first time in history, Homo sapiens would be forced to share the idea of humanity with another species equally capable of emotion, culture, language, family, memory, grief. And honestly, that might terrify people more than aliens ever could. Because aliens are distant. Neanderthals would be familiar, too familiar, close enough to look human, different enough to threaten the story we've always told ourselves, that this planet belongs to us alone. And maybe that's why their extinction changed everything, because the moment the last Neanderthal disappeared, Homo sapiens became the only human story left to tell. And maybe that's the strangest part of the entire story. For hundreds of thousands of years, Neanderthals looked at the same sky we do now. They sat beside fires, protected their families, survived brutal winters, believed tomorrow would come again. And then one day, it didn't. Somewhere in Ice Age Europe, the last Neanderthal died without knowing. Their entire species was disappearing with them. No final speech, no dramatic ending, just silence. And after that, for the first time in human history, we were alone. Maybe that's why their story still feels uncomfortable, because it reminds us that intelligence does not guarantee survival. Strength does not guarantee survival. Even surviving for 400,000 years does not guarantee survival. And honestly, maybe modern humans are not as different from them as we think. We are still trying to survive a changing world, still trying to find connection, still afraid of being left behind. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for more stories about ancient humans, evolution, and the forgotten history of humanity.